What's up, Indiana fans? Welcome to another episode of the Indiana Hoosiers Roundtable podcast. I am Brandon Brown, joined again by Todd Golden. And Todd, we were actually going to get going here a little bit ago, but then we had to pause. Indiana basketball has picked up a commitment from the transfer portal. 6'2" guard Jason Drake out of Drexel. I mean, it literally is, as we're recording this, less than an hour old. So, what do you know about the kid, and how big of a deal is this?
Yeah, it's he visited Indiana yesterday. He's kind of a combo guard in some ways, averaged 11.1 points for Drexel last year. Athletic, shoots the ball well, good three-point shooter, really good free throw shooter. It's another front court or backcourt piece that the team is starting to fill itself up now with guards. So where he fits in terms of how he competes with Tatum Connerway, Connor Enright, Josiah Miles, players like that, we'll see. The one thing is that Darian DeVries is obviously adding a lot of competition in this backcourt, so that'll be interesting to see how that plays out over the course of the offseason and into next year. But he's kind of well traveled. He started his career at Cleveland State, then he dropped down to the JUCO level for a year, and then found his way at Drexel last year, which Drexel's in the CAA, which isn't a bad conference, one of the better mid-major conferences. So we'll see. What Indiana needs now, though, is some front court pieces, and they're still working on that. So.
What is the latest on that? Adding some big guys. I mean, you mentioned this is another guard. We talked about Darian DeVries wants to find shooters, so I don't know if that extends to the front court players. But yeah, what is the latest on looking for some size to add to this roster?
Well, they've gone at a few guys that have committed elsewhere, guys like Duke Brennan and a few others, but they keep bringing guys in, and haven't gotten any firm commitments yet. We'll see if that changes this week. It needs to. So, nothing that seems really hot on the burner right this minute, or that seems imminent. But for now, and the thing is we're working under the assumption that the scholarship limits and roster sizes are going to be a certain thing, and who knows whether that's going to be true or not. So we'll see. But right now, the tallest player they have is Reed Bailey. I mean, that's the one. I suppose he's a front court player, but he's more of a stretch forward. So they do have him, but it's a little bit more, a lot more depth is needed in the front court, and they're working on it. So we'll see what happens with it.
It's interesting because of the way anytime a coach takes a new job, you expect a lot of turnover, lots of additions from the transfer portal. That's how the roster has to be put together in order to put a team on the court. What does that say? How is Indiana doing in that big picture? Every site has their own kind of different set of rankings. I mean, obviously, when you turn over an entire roster, you got a lot of new pieces that tends to bump the numbers up a little bit. But I guess, yeah, that's the question. How is Indiana doing big picture when it comes to the transfer portal, maybe in comparison to some other programs that are also going through the same thing right now?
Yeah, it really kind of depends. It's fascinating to look at that stuff because I wrote about it on Sunday. Each website that tracks that does it a little bit differently. Like, for example, if you just purely graded on the players that were brought in and no other factors, Indiana, I think it was 247 Sports, had them ranked fourth, and that was before they added Jason Drake. I don't know if his addition is going to really bump that up much, but so based on pure talent, Indiana's done a really good job. The one I thought was fascinating is the way that On3 Sports does it, where they kind of create a grade based on what you lost versus what you gained.
Mm-hmm.
In that sense, Indiana was more middle of the pack. Now, the problem with that ranking is that it doesn't take into account a coaching change. So, even if Indiana had brought all their players back, that doesn't necessarily mean they would have been as productive. Some would have been more productive. Some might have been less. So that ranking system probably makes a little bit more sense for a coach that that stuck around from year to year. With a new coach, I'm not sure it's all that relevant. It is interesting though. I mean, by their estimation, Indiana has had at that point added in about maybe a little bit of skosh more than what they lost in terms of production, but that's just a general number. It doesn't take into account positioning and how players fit and stuff like that. But it's interesting to look at, though. I mean, it's all, speculative and largely meaningless, but it does give you a barometer of where things can be. And but so far it seems like the places that assess based on just purely the talent of the players, Indiana's done a really good job. Tucker DeVries and Lamar Wilkerson are the two big ones that bump that up. I mean, DeVries, had he thrown his commitment out there to everybody, would have been highly sought after. He would have had blue bloods going after him. Um, so I think Indiana's done a pretty good job. They just, they have a ways to go. I mean, they're rebuilding the entire roster.
Yeah.
So, they may, and that's the other thing too. I mean, the more players you bring in just depends on how the various websites rank them. The higher you might be, I don't know how many of them take into account the volume of players versus the quality of players. But I think the only important thing for Indiana is that DeVries brings in players that fit what he wants to do.
Mm-hmm.
And so far, it seems like he's done a really good job of that. For example, Tate Connerway, you can look at his scoring statistics and they're fine, but what he really does well is forces the issue defensively. He's a steal machine. So that's what matters. I mean, I think Indiana fans know that as well as anybody, because the last couple of years they brought in some good classes, but did they mesh together very well? Not really. So hopefully DeVries is able to match all these pieces together correctly. And it seems like, at least on paper, he's done a pretty good job of that so far.
I think that is interesting. And you mentioned different sites doing it differently. I'm going to refer to the book of Todd here for a second. How big of a deal is it that they haven't landed any true bigs, though? I mean, that's another thing that's not really factored in. You mentioned fit and making sure you get pieces that you need. Obviously, you have to put 5 out there, so you need some bigs. So I guess kind of a two-part question. How good do you think they've done based on what's already there and what they're still missing? And how big of a problem is it that they don't seem to have any bigs right now?
I don't know how big of an issue it is because the portal is still evolving.
Sure.
It closes today, but it's hard to know that because the pool of candidates hasn't been consistent all the way through.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think my impression of the portal overall this year is there's been a few big fish in there, but this portal has been more about, complementary pieces coming from mid majors and things like that. Like there wasn't a Hunter Dickinson out there this year to go get. There was, or at least I shouldn't say that. There were a few players like that, but not like a whole bunch of players like that. And so, when you're trying to assess mid-major guys moving up, that can be a real difficult thing to do. I mean, some of them pan out great, some of them don't pan out at all. So it's hard for me to say that they're falling short because a lot of these guys are unproven in the first place, and because there's been more guys that have put themselves into the portal over the last few days too. So for the people who want, immediate satisfaction, it probably feels a little bit uneasy, but I don't think the portal really works like that. I think there are still over 1,000 players in the portal now. Most of them wouldn't be able to compete at Indiana, but so I don't know. I guess I'm kind of hedging a little bit, but it doesn't seem to me like there's no crisis at this point, because I don't see that there's like a bunch of available 5-star guys that haven't committed yet or that were ever available in the first place. So again, then you kind of fall back on fit with what DeVries wants, and what he wants is what he is probably missing from what I've seen of his teams over the years is that one big who can be a rim protector and a physical presence in the paint. I don't know that they have that yet. So that might be something that they're seeking. In that sense, that they don't have it yet is a little concerning, I suppose. But I don't think it's any reason to hit the panic button either. I mean, it's still just April 22nd. And
Yeah.
the portal, for fans who don't understand this, because it can be, all of this stuff still is relatively new to most fans. The portal closes today, but players can sign whenever they want. So, that's just the deadline is to get into the portal. So players themselves need to get on the stick today, but the teams can, they're fine. So so it's not like there's any urgency, or that this isn't like a um, you know like a pro style deadline where you have to be signed by a certain date. It doesn't really work like that. So I'm not too worried about it yet. But yeah, they need that's obviously an area of need, and I know that they're trying to address it. They just haven't been able to get anybody in yet.
Yeah, I was gonna say, but we are still
Other than Reed Bailey. I mean, I don't want to leave him out. So
I was gonna say we are still 6 months away from the season. It's not like they need to trot anybody out there within the next couple of weeks. But yeah, that is interesting because it does seem to be. I mean, it doesn't seem to be. It is. It's guard heavy at this point, and obviously that'll need to be addressed moving forward. Well, one thing that should help address that, with the world of NIL and the house settlement and all of that stuff coming down the pike. Reading your notes, I don't know the exact ins and outs of this, so I'm actually curious. And as usual, you will inform me about several things involving the money side of college athletics now, because it is kind of a whirlwind. And if you're not plugged into it every day, you can get left behind pretty quickly. But in your notes, you say that Indiana is one of 10 schools now in the $10 million club. That certainly sounds like a good thing, Todd. Exactly what does that mean, and what could it mean moving forward for the Hoosiers?
yeah, CBS Sports did a story yesterday, based on their sources. None of this is completely 100%. They know all the numbers, but based on what they were able to find, they believe that there's 10 programs out there that are going to be spending $10 million on their basketball rosters. Now, that's a combination of two different things. That's NIL collective money plus the revenue sharing money that's supposed to come out of the still to be approved house settlement. So, um, Indiana, as far as the house settlement part of it the revenue sharing part of it is concerned, Indiana has long been assumed to be one of the schools that's going to use more of their $20 million budget to apply to basketball, because just as a reminder to everybody, um, the house settlement is going to set up revenue sharing, and each school, if they opt in, will be able to spend roughly $20 million on their entire athletic department.
Mhm.
Most schools are going to spend a big chunk of that on football because it's the revenue producing sport. Some other schools are going to spend, allocate a, depending on what their priority is, a certain percentage to basketball. Indiana, obviously being a basketball school, it's widely assumed that they're going to use more of that kitty on basketball. We don't have the numbers yet. None of that is publicly available. It's not even approved yet, but they're working with the assumption that's how it'll work. So that's where that comes from. So extrapolate that what you will. We don't know the specific number yet, but I'm sure it's, a couple $1 million at least. And then, the NIL collective money that's been there for the last few years, which has gone way up also because of the house settlement, because of the clearinghouse situation that might come in. So players are trying to cash in this year. It's driven up the market. So that's where that all comes from. No surprise that Indiana is up there near the top. They've always had the resources to compete. It's just a matter of whether they can put it on the court. And the teams that were in there with them were also not surprising. We're talking about Kentucky, Louisville, Arkansas, UCLA, I believe was in there. St. John's was in there. That was slightly surprising, although a lot of these schools that, one thing that football playing schools are a little bit worried about this year is the Big East style schools, the private schools that don't play football. Their budget is still $20 million if they have that. So they're worried that the Big East schools are going to be able to throw way more money at basketball than a lot of other schools will. So that's one interesting aspect of all this. But so Indiana being up there, yeah, it's a great thing. I mean, you want to be able to, if you're in this world where money matters, you need money, to make it simple. So Indiana has it. They have the resources. They just need to apply it on the floor, which has been the issue over the last few years. They just haven't been able to do that. So, a lot of several other Big Ten programs were right behind. CBS had $8 million schools in their story. Purdue was in there, a couple others. So, it doesn't get any easier to compete in this league. And Indiana is playing from behind a little bit in terms of trying to get back into contention in the Big Ten. So every little bit helps, and it's probably heartening for Indiana fans to know that they're right, that they're not being, naive or cheap about this. They're trying to compete in the new way that college athletics works.
You named most of them. They have labeled it the golden tier, by the way, the $10 million club. It's Arkansas, BYU. That's an interesting one. Duke, Indiana, Kentucky, Louisville, Michigan, North Carolina, St. John's, and Texas Tech. I'm actually kind of surprised to see Michigan in there. I would say the only football school, dare I say, in the group is Michigan. That's kind of an interesting point as well. Yeah, St. John's. That's kind of surprising. BYU, Arkansas. With Cal, you kind of maybe expect that now, but yeah,
B-
that is.
yeah, BYU's got money though. I mean, they always
Yeah.
have. Basketball's a big deal at BYU, although it's probably more thought of as a football school, I would say. But they want to. They're in the Big 12. They have to have that level of commitment to. That's obviously a good basketball league, and same thing for Texas Tech, which I think of more as a football school because their old Southwest Conference ties long ago, and they've had some good football teams over the years. But um, it's good. I like the schools that are more well-rounded like that. It's good. I'm glad Michigan's in that group. I mean, and it makes it harder for IU because they have to compete directly against them in the Big Ten. But it's going to be what I think is fascinating about all this is, some Big Ten schools have been really caught out by NIL and in terms of how they allocate it. We're learning as this kind of evolves, which schools are willing to commit to what. And, you get to some of the other school, we're at a basketball school. I know IU football is, we're going to talk about IU football in a little bit, but, it's coming off a great playoff season, but traditionally it's a basketball school, and same thing for Purdue. But most of the other Big Ten schools are football first. And it's been fascinating. You look at a school like, say, Minnesota, where they've really struggled in basketball. Not actually, I thought Ben Johnson did a really good job there and kind of was fired unjustly, in my opinion, given the resources that they had up there. But it's taken some time for them to, and it's not a natural thing for them to have NIL money for basketball. And same thing for Iowa, same thing for Wisconsin, Nebraska, schools that are definitely more football focused. So it's kind of created some tiers within the Big Ten in terms of what they're willing to spend on. And but although I say that, and then the evolution, though, of where some guys have gone in the Big Ten, like Washington's been very aggressive in going after guys, including former IU guard Bryson Tucker is headed to Washington. USC seems to be in the mix for a lot of people. So they're, you think of them as a football school first, and they're giving it their shot in basketball. So it's very, it feels very unstable, but not in necessarily a bad way, just in things are still evolving. And
Yeah.
so, it'll be interesting to see how the various schools in the Big Ten kind of fall into that. And, I'm sure people doing a podcast at some of the other Big Ten schools are probably wondering whether Indiana can continue to commit to football, stuff like that. So it's fascinating in its way. It's also, if you're on the wrong end of it, very frustrating. And, it kind of makes you long for the good old days where it didn't work like this. But it's good to know that for the sport that matters most to people in Indiana, they have the resources to do what they need to do in it.
Yeah, you mentioned that next tier. You mentioned Purdue, UCLA, and USC, also from the Big Ten, and I mean, it's pretty much like the whole elite part of the tournament this past year. Auburn, UConn, Florida, Houston, Kansas, like Miami, Purdue, Tennessee, like all the big name schools are, and that's what you expect. Right?
Yeah.
I mean, the big name schools with the programs that are successful are going to continue to try to be successful and put money into it. That's how it works.
Some of it is force of personality too. Like I wouldn't expect Auburn to be in the higher spending basketball groups if Bruce Pearl wasn't there.
Right.
I
Same
mean,
thing I said with Cal and Arkansas. I mean, like that's kind of an automatic
right.
marriage because of who's there.
Yeah. Although they do
They've
have,
had some run, yeah.
they were very good in the 90s, of course, and all of that. But they're, Arkansas, you think of as all the SEC schools, other than maybe Kentucky, you think of as SEC first,
Yeah.
football first. So yeah, it's fascinating. It'll be interesting if the House settlement is approved, where this money goes, whether it drops off a little bit. But right now, money doesn't seem to be much of an object for the Hoosiers.
There you have it. Well, you mentioned football a couple times. We will get into that now. A lot of teams are putting a bow on the spring session. Indiana did so. I think maybe it was the day we recorded last week, or maybe it was the
Yeah,
next
it
day. I
was.
forget.
Yep, last Thursday. Yep.
So it's been a few days now, but I guess before we get into some of the specifics, we're going to talk about quarterback Fernando Mendoza. We'll talk about some of the defensive players. Just big picture from kind of your 10,000-foot view. How did the spring game go? Was there a buzz? Was there an excitement? What was the format like? How did it go? Just kind of in general.
Buzz, I would say probably not. The crowd wasn't bad. I mean, it was a free event, but it was also at 8 o'clock on a Thursday night on a, it's still classes in session. If people wanted to come, it wasn't on the buzz around spring games in general. I think across the sport this year are way down.
Definitely.
It wasn't televised. It wasn't streamed. So if you wanted to see it, you had to be there. But on an 8 o'clock night, people weren't, unless you're a diehard, you're not driving down from Fort Wayne or Indy or Evansville or the Louisville area or anything like that. I mean, it wasn't, I thought I'm terrible at estimating crowds. They only had the east side of the stadium open. So that's within our view from up in the press box. The seats under the press box where that part of the stadium wasn't even open. I would say there was maybe 5,000 people there at the most. So, but that's pretty typical for Indiana and spring football. I mean, it's just not a thing. I wrote a column last week asking out loud, are you guys into this? And frankly, the response I got for some people was like, we'll be into it once the games start. We're not going to be throwing our emotional investment into spring football. So that's just the way it goes in Indiana. I mean, not just at Indiana University. I mean, Purdue's like that. All State, Indiana State, you name it. I mean, other than Notre Dame, they're all like that. So that's just part of the culture of the state of Indiana. So I would say the buzz was pretty minimal. And then the fact that, and I mean, they played a half of quote unquote football. I mean, it was tackling. So that was good to see. But apart from that, it was a very controlled type of scrimmage situation. Curt Cignetti kind of downplayed it ahead of time too. So it wasn't like he was hyping it in anything. It was what it was. I mean, I'm glad they did it. Would it have been, would I have felt a sense of loss if they didn't have the spring game? Probably not, to be honest. I mean, it was nice to see some players play in anger, which is kind of what I said last week, I think. But once you get past that, though, I mean, it's still an evolving enterprise. I mean, there's still going to be players brought in yet. A few players have gone into the portal. Nobody who would be a starter for IU, but the portal is open for football through the end of this week. So, so it doesn't feel, it's not like the old days where it was, you could truly get kind of a litmus test kind of feel off of it. It just doesn't really work like that anymore. And, at the end of the day, it's spring football. It's an exhibition, basically. So, so no, I wouldn't say there was much of a buzz to it. I mean, I wish it was. I wish it was. I'm no different than anybody else. I mean, I've spent most of my adult life in Indiana, so I don't really get fired up for
Fair.
to be perfectly honest. So I totally understand where fans are coming from. What you wondered was coming off a playoff season, whether there would be how that fever might translate to a time of year that isn't naturally
Right.
very well invested in emotionally. So I guess we got our answer. I mean, football fans, even with the playoff season, are still, hey, we love it, but we don't love it that much, basically.
Maybe not in April. It'll feel different in the fall. That's
I would imagine, then you get down to the brass tacks of, who's where on the depth chart and things like that. And you get a sense of that. I mean, the one thing I will give Indiana credit for is, although several players did sit out, Aiden Fisher didn't play, Mikhail Kamara didn't play, wide receiver Elijah Sarrett didn't play. He had a dinged up knee, nothing serious. Same thing with Fisher. We don't know why Kamara didn't play, but so there were some key pieces. And D'Angelo Pons, cornerback, he didn't play. He did play, but not much. But for the most part, it was ones against ones and twos against twos. So you did get an idea of that. But, but it's very much like a rough draft
Yeah.
where it is right now. So, rough drafts are rough drafts. We'll see where it goes.
I think one of the things we talked about last week before the spring game was at least getting a chance to put some eyeballs on new quarterback Fernando Mendoza. Got a chance to do that. You also mentioned the running game. So yeah, I guess just a couple points on the offensive side of things, especially
Yeah,
the new QB.
it was Fernando Mendoza looked pretty good. The IU defense did put some pressure on him. He was quote unquote sacked, tagged
Yeah.
on the first series of the game. So that was good from a defensive standpoint. And that's the one thing you never see or we don't get to see in practice very much is how pressure is handled. So, Indiana was able to put some good pressure on him early. He did throw a pick six, sideline route over to Elijah Hardy, who is the most opportunistic player I've ever seen. But, I'm exaggerating a little bit, but he's just always seems to be in on plays like that. But he also was, I don't have the stats in front of me, but he was also, I think he only had 4 incomplete passes in the game or in the scrimmage. So showed some signs of what people feel he's capable of, showed some things he needs to work on a little bit too. So, but nothing that was, it wasn't like he completed 35% of his passes. He was pretty efficient. And, nothing that would give anybody any pause about whether he's going to be able to lead this team next fall. His brother Alberto Mendoza threw the ball pretty well too. So it's the Mendoza show at quarterback this year, at least as things currently stand. So it was fine. The running game looked pretty good. I've liked the running game through the course of spring anyway. It's something that I think has been strong. The new running back, Lee Beebe from UAB. I don't have the estimated numbers in front of me. They didn't keep real stats, but he was the leading rusher, did a good job. He got the most carries too, because he did play a little bit with the twos. So he got a little bit more, few more snaps. But he looked good. I think Roman Hemby, the transfer out of Maryland, is going to be really good. He had he just does it. He does a really good job of just reading the holes and reading his blocks and things like that. Did a good job. Kalon Black, who was on the team last year, broke I think it was a 44-yard run at one point. So he looked good. And he kind of tailed off a little bit towards the end of last year. So it'll be good for him to get back on the stick. So I feel like they can run the ball. I feel like the sort of retooled offensive line did good in terms of run blocking. There was a few pass pro issues, but nothing that would be, too much concern. So it was fine. The offense did win, quote unquote, the scrimmage 31-23 based on the scoring system they used. I still think the scoring system's a little bit too skewed to offense, but whatever. Who cares? It's a spring game, but but it was, I did think the defense also though showed some encouraging signs as well.
Well, good segue into that. You mentioned Elijah Hardy and the pick six. I mean, yeah, pick six should be pretty valuable for a defense, you would think. I don't know how they score that exactly, but
I don't have Elijah Hardy's stats in front of me. He was a reserve linebacker for most of last year. Then he kind of got in on their mix when they switched their formation up a little bit midseason. He got more snaps, but that dude has a knack for the ball. I mean, whether it's a fumble recovery, forced fumble, in this case interception, he really has an uncommon knack to be in the right place at the right time. So, some of the players commented on that after the game on Thursday. I brought it up to Coach Signetti, how good he's been. And, he definitely, he's ascended into a true starting role this year. So that's good to see. Indiana didn't really test the defensive backs too much on too many deep throws. So it's kind of hard to assess that with only basically what amounted to a half of football to get a really good assessment on that. I thought the pass rush was fine. It was weird because, based on the stats that both Mendoza's had, their stats were fine, but they were flushed out of the pocket a few times. So mostly reserve defensive linemen, guys like Dominique Ratcliffe and players like that who are emerging this season. So, the defense was nasty last year. I think the defense was a bigger key to Indiana's success than it gets credit for. I'm not that it didn't get credit, but so hopefully that will continue. But I guess the bottom line is for all of it is that there was nothing that jumped out as a huge concern one way or the other. It's not like there were alarm bells that went off on either side of the ball or special teams. They did take there are a few field, Nico Radicic is back at kicker and he was perfect. So there's a lot of things you don't see really special teams or anything like that, but it was what it was. It was, just no drama, no stress, nothing that would make you believe that Indiana can't be good again next year. So
No red flags and no injuries. That's about all you can hope for in the
yeah,
spring
no
game.
injuries, nothing in the scrimmage itself. There's
Couple
several guys who were
this week.
out for most of the spring. Drew Evans, Khalil Benson jump to mind. Morris, the wide receiver, of course, he's out for the year. But but apart from that, full steam ahead for the Hoosiers.
There you go. Last but not least, we are just a couple of days away from the NFL draft now. A couple of Hoosiers hoping to hear their name called, I guess. What's the prognosis for defensive tackle CJ West and, of course, quarterback Kurtis Rourke?
Yeah, I was looking at it a little bit. I'll have a story later today on where people see these guys. CJ, I saw somebody pick CJ West to go in the second round. I was surprised to see that. Most of the mock draft thing is another, there's a lot of them and, it's all speculation, but for the most part, CJ West would have been what I've seen is kind of middle of the NFL draft, like 4th, 5th round, something like that. He had a good combine and he can move. So that's something that NFL teams, of course, value in the interior of the defensive line. So that's where I'd expect him to go. The only other player I'd anticipate probably or maybe being drafted is Kurtis Rourke at quarterback. Most of the projections I've seen of him were late, were to be drafted, in a late round. So, although I did see him move up a little bit in some projections too, it's just hard to know how viable some of these mock drafts really are. But those are the only two that I would anticipate, should hear their names on draft day. Anybody else is probably looking at, signing a free agent contract after the draft. So,
Gotcha.
So despite IU's success, a lot of the players who would have been draftable came back. Guys like Mikhail Kamara and I would think Aiden Fisher. He would probably be a lower round draft pick, I would think. But D'Angelo Pons, I think, will eventually be an NFL prospect. Elijah Sarrett, players like that, they came back. So that's good news for IU football. But there won't be a ton of Indiana names in the draft. I mean, West and Rourke were the only NFL Combine invitees. Rourke wasn't able to participate because he had just had his surgery at that point. So West was the only one who actually went out there and did the Combine. So it's not going to be a draft full of Hoosiers, but but hopefully for the sake of CJ West and Kurtis Rourke that they hear their names on later this week.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, Rourke is a gamer. He just kind of, he's a guy I would, probably a backup type of player, but not a bad one to maybe have to lean on. And he's going to bring some good stuff to the locker room, I think. And he's a hard worker, and you hear all that stuff about him. And then mentioned.
The thing about Rourke is that he's really intelligent too. He really does see the, that side of the game really well. Do I see him as a lead pipe NFL quarterback? I don't, but I could see him working his way into that position because he's got the intelligence to do it. He's older too, though. I mean, he's not a young guy, so that works in his favor in some ways and works against him in other ways. But I would think if you're looking for somebody to be a solid 2 or 3 on your depth chart, you could do a lot worse than Kurtis Rourke.
And you mentioned CJ West running a 4.95 at 316 pounds. That's noteworthy for a defensive
That's
tackle.
what
I mean, that's he's big enough to play right over the center. He's probably more of a shade nose guard, but still being able to move like that, that's coveted. That's coveted in the NFL. So
he was
that'll be
one of the
interesting.
quickest interior defensive linemen at the combine. So, and he's also got a good head on his shoulders too. CJ's a good student of the game, and he'll work and has a hell of a work ethic. So, so I think and I think that's being reflected by where people think he's going to be picked. So, as it is with any player, it just depends on fit when you get up there, and all of that. A lot of this depends on some element of good fortune in that sense. But I think both those guys though would be an asset if they were picked by any NFL team, and so we'll see what happens later this week with the draft.
Well, there you have it. He's Todd Golden. I am Brandon Brown. Thank you for listening to another episode of the Indiana Hoosiers Roundtable podcast. We'll be back next week, and we'll get a chance to see if Kurtis Rourke gets his name called, where CJ West goes, and we'll talk more Indiana athletics. Thanks a lot for listening, everybody.
Yep. Thanks, everybody.